Hey guys, tonight we're slipping into the shadows of medieval Europe, where the flickering candlelight barely illuminates the face of a figure pressed against cold stone walls. You can almost feel the dampness seeping through rough-hewn blocks, smell the mixture of unwashed bodies and fear that permeates these forgotten corridors. Tonight, we're exploring why becoming a medieval assassin, that romanticized figure of stealth and skill, was actually one of the worst career choices you could possibly make. You probably won't survive this story, but at least you'll understand why those mysterious hooded figures in movies had such perpetually grim expressions. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment letting me know where you're listening from and what time it is there. I love seeing this community span the globe. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're 7 years old when they take you. Not because you volunteered. Obviously, what child dreams of a career in murder? But because you showed promise. Maybe you were quick on your feet, escaping punishment from the local lord's guards. Perhaps you demonstrated an unsettling ability to move silently through your family's cramped hovel. Whatever caught their attention, it sealed your fate in the most irreversible way imaginable. The recruitment process bears no resemblance to the noble calling depicted in later legends. You're simply snatched from everything familiar, often during times of war or famine, when one less mouth to feed doesn't generate much investigation. Your family might assume you died, were conscripted, or simply wandered off, children disappearing, wasn't exactly headline news in an era where half of all kids never reached adulthood anyway. Historical records from the medieval period show that most professional killers were recruited as children, primarily because adult minds proved too set in their ways to accept the necessary psychological conditioning. The famous Hashishin sect, operating from mountain fortresses in Persia and Syria, perfected this technique of childhood indoctrination centuries before European assassin guilds adopted similar methods. Your new family consists of other stolen children and the grim-faced adults who broke them years earlier. The compound, whether hidden in forest caves, abandoned monasteries, or specially constructed underground chambers, becomes your entire world. Historians still argue whether these training facilities were as elaborate as some sources suggest, or if most assassin groups operated from much more modest, improvised locations. The indoctrination begins immediately and never truly ends. You learn that your previous life was meaningless, that your birth family were obstacles to your true calling, and that questioning orders represents not just disobedience, but existential failure. Religious justification often accompanies this brainwashing. You're told that eliminating specific targets serves God's will, protects the innocent, or maintains cosmic balance. The specifics vary depending on which group claimed you and what political objectives they serve. Sleep becomes a luxury rationed like food and water. You're awakened at random hours for training exercises, punishment sessions, or psychological evaluations designed to measure your progress toward complete emotional detachment. The other children become simultaneously your only companions and your greatest threats. Forming genuine friendships is discouraged through various cruel methods that pit you against each other in competitions where losing might mean death. Here's something particularly twisted that most people don't realize. Medieval assassin training deliberately cultivated certain mental illnesses that modern psychology recognizes as severe personality disorders. You're systematically trained to suppress empathy, embrace paranoia as survival instinct, and view human life, including your own, as disposable currency in larger political transactions. The physical training starts before your bones finish growing, ensuring that your developing body adapts to impossible demands. You learn to dislocate joints voluntarily, control your breathing to near-death states, and endure pain that would incapacitate normal adults. But here's the catch. This early conditioning also guarantees chronic injuries, shortened lifespan, and constant physical agony that will plague your entire career. By the time you've survived the initial selection process, you've essentially ceased to exist as the person you might have become. The child who loved simple pleasures, feared reasonable dangers, and dreamed innocent dreams has been systematically murdered and replaced with something else entirely, a tool crafted for a single, terrible purpose that will define every remaining moment of your existence. The training regimen that transforms you from kidnapped child into functional killer would make modern special forces programs look like summer camp. You wake each morning before dawn, assuming you were permitted to sleep, with muscles already screaming from yesterday's brutality, knowing that today will somehow prove even worse. Your instructors, themselves products of this same merciless system, have long since abandoned any pretense of normal human emotion. They view your suffering not as cruelty, but as necessary craftsmanship, the way a blacksmith views the hammer blows that shape raw iron into useful tools. Every broken bone, every dislocated joint, every moment of agony represents progress toward your ultimate function. Physical conditioning begins with seemingly impossible demands. You're required to climb vertical stone walls using only fingertip strength, then repeat the exercise while carrying weighted packs that increase incrementally each week. Your fingers bleed, then callous, then develop the hook-like strength needed to support your entire body weight on mere cracks in masonry. But here's what the romanticized versions never mention. This training permanently deforms your hands, leaving them gnarled and arthritic decades before their time. Balance training involves walking increasingly narrow beams suspended over genuine hazards, not padded mats, but actual spikes, flames, or wild animals that will genuinely kill you if you fall. Medieval training documents recovered from dissolved monastic libraries describe exercises where apprentice assassins practice their craft on condemned criminals, learning anatomy through live dissection rather than theoretical study. The psychological conditioning proves even more devastating than physical torture. You're forced to kill animals with your bare hands, starting with small creatures, and gradually progressing to larger ones. This isn't just about overcoming squeamishness. It's systematic desensitization, designed to rewire your brain's fundamental responses to violence and death. Modern neuroscience confirms that this type of conditioning creates specific changes in brain structure that persist throughout life. Combat training focuses exclusively on killing techniques rather than sporting combat. You learn 17 different ways to snap a human neck, how to identify vulnerable spots where a single finger thrust can prove fatal, and the precise angle needed to slide a blade between ribs without hitting bone. There's no defensive training, no rules of engagement, no concept of honorable combat, only efficiency in ending human life. Here's a delightfully grim detail that most people miss. Medieval assassins were specifically trained to use improvised weapons because carrying obvious armaments invited unwanted attention. You become expert at transforming ordinary objects, eating utensils, sewing needles, belt buckles, even coins, into lethal instruments. This skill development requires practicing thousands of strikes on human cadavers to understand how different materials interact with flesh and bone. Stealth training involves months spent in complete darkness, developing enhanced hearing and spatial awareness that border on supernatural. You learn to identify individuals by their breathing patterns, heartbeat rhythms, and distinctive scents. But this sensory amplification comes with severe psychological side effects. Many trainees develop debilitating agoraphobia or become unable to tolerate normal levels of light and sound. The weapons training never ends because your life depends on maintaining peak proficiency with tools that require constant practice. Medieval assassins specialized in easily concealed weapons, stilettos thin enough to slip between chainmail links, garrots disguised as religious cord belts, or poison-tipped pins hidden in clothing. But maintaining these skills requires daily practice that tears apart your hands, wrists, and shoulders through repetitive stress that accumulates over years. Historians still argue whether medieval assassin schools employed the elaborate obstacle courses described in some period accounts, or if such descriptions represent later fictional embellishments. However, archaeological evidence from sites like Alamut Castle suggests that these training facilities were indeed equipped with sophisticated apparatus designed to test human limits. Perhaps most cruelly, the training deliberately cultivates abilities you'll never be permitted to enjoy. You develop extraordinary athletic prowess, mental acuity, and survival instincts that could make you exceptional at peaceful pursuits. But your conditioning ensures you can never experience normal happiness, form healthy relationships, or find meaning outside your lethal calling. The final phase of training involves increasingly realistic scenarios where failure means actual death rather than punishment. You're sent on missions where success requires eliminating other trainees, ensuring that your graduation ceremony doubles as a funeral for classmates who couldn't match your developing skills. By the time you're declared ready for real assignments, you've already killed more people than most soldiers see in entire military careers. Graduation from assassin training doesn't bring relief. It introduces you to an entirely new category of psychological torment that will define every remaining moment of your existence. You now live in a world where absolutely everyone represents a potential threat, where showing trust equals signing your own death warrant, and where genuine human connection becomes literally impossible. Your first independent assignment teaches you the fundamental rule of assassin survival. Assume everyone is trying to kill you, because they probably are. The merchant who offers you directions might be reporting your location to enemies. The innkeeper who seems friendly could be poisoning your food. That fellow traveler who shares your campfire tonight might slit your throat before dawn. This isn't paranoid delusion. It's accurate threat assessment in a profession where retired practitioners don't exist because they're all dead. Sleep becomes a carefully calculated risk rather than natural rest. You learn to position yourself where multiple escape routes remain available, to wake at the slightest unusual sound, and to keep weapons within instant reach even while unconscious. But chronic sleep deprivation accumulates over years, degrading your judgment, reflexes, and mental stability at precisely the moments when peak performance means survival. The constant hypervigilance required for staying alive destroys your ability to experience normal human pleasures. You can't enjoy a meal without analyzing potential poison symptoms, can't appreciate music without scanning for approaching footsteps, can't watch a sunset without calculating how the changing light affects your tactical situation. Every experience gets filtered through survival calculations that eliminate spontaneity, beauty, and joy from your daily existence. Medieval records from various assassin organizations reveal that practitioners developed elaborate systems of code words, secret signs, and verification protocols to identify allies versus enemies. But these systems created their own vulnerabilities. Rivals could infiltrate your network by learning the codes, turning your security measures into traps that delivered you directly into enemy hands. Trust becomes impossible because betrayal represents standard business practice in the assassination trade. The contact who hired you for this mission might be setting you up for elimination on the next one. Fellow assassins aren't colleagues, they're competitors for limited contracts who benefit directly from your death. Even your original training organization might decide you know too much about their methods and operations, marking you for retirement in the permanent sense. Here's something particularly twisted about medieval assassin psychology. You develop genuine affection for your weapons because they represent the only reliable relationships in your life. Your knife won't betray you. Your poison won't abandon you. Your garrote won't sell information about you to enemies. This attachment to inanimate objects often became so pronounced that assassins were buried with their favorite tools, suggesting they viewed these instruments as closer than family. The social isolation compounds over time, creating cascading mental health problems that medieval practitioners had no vocabulary to describe or treat. You watch normal people forming friendships, falling in love, raising families, and participating in community celebrations, experiences that remain forever beyond your reach, because emotional vulnerability equals tactical suicide in your profession. Communication with others requires constant performance, maintaining whatever false identity your current mission demands, while suppressing any authentic expression of personality or feeling. You become expert at mimicking normal human behavior without ever being permitted to experience it genuinely. This psychological split between performed identity and suppressed self creates cognitive dissonance that drives many practitioners toward complete madness. Historians still argue whether medieval assassins ever attempted to form genuine relationships with each other, or if the mutual suspicion inherent in their profession made such connections impossible. Some evidence suggests that very rarely long-term partnerships developed between assassins who worked together repeatedly. But these relationships typically ended in betrayal when one partner received a contract targeting the other. The paranoia extends beyond immediate physical threats to encompass every aspect of daily existence. You suspect merchants of overcharging because they recognize you as someone with dangerous knowledge. You imagine tavern conversations stopping when you enter because patrons somehow sense your true profession. You interpret innocent glances as surveillance, casual questions as interrogation attempts, and friendly gestures as manipulation tactics. Perhaps most destructively, the constant paranoia becomes self-fulfilling prophecy. Your suspicious behavior draws attention from people who might otherwise ignore you completely. Your defensive posture provokes conflicts that could be avoided through normal social interaction. Your inability to trust creates situations that justify your lack of trust, trapping you in cycles of escalating hostility that usually end in violence. The psychological pressure eventually breaks most practitioners long before physical injury claims their lives. You develop elaborate rituals and superstitions designed to manage anxiety levels that would hospitalize normal people. But these coping mechanisms often become compulsions that interfere with mission effectiveness, creating additional dangers that compound your already overwhelming stress burden. Contrary to popular imagination, being a medieval assassin doesn't make you wealthy. It makes you desperately poor in ways that constant mortal danger somehow makes even worse. You discover that professional killing, despite requiring extraordinary skills and carrying ultimate risks, pays significantly less than ordinary trades like carpentry, brewing, or textile work. The economics of assassination create a perfectly miserable situation where demand remains low while supply stays dangerously high. Political figures who want rivals eliminated don't require such services frequently enough to support many practitioners. Meanwhile, the training organizations continue producing new assassins who compete for the same limited contracts, driving prices down to subsistence levels or below. Your typical payment structure involves 3 installments: a small advance to cover immediate expenses, a larger sum upon successful completion, and a final payment that you'll never receive because you're expected to die during the mission. Clients rationalize this arrangement by claiming that dead assassins can't reveal their employers' identities, a convenient excuse for avoiding the largest portion of agreed compensation. Medieval financial records from various courts show that assassins were typically paid between 1/10 and 1/4 of what skilled craftsmen earned annually, despite risking execution if captured and spending years acquiring specialized abilities. A master mason building cathedral stonework earned more in a single season than most assassins collected from multiple contracts, and the mason got to sleep peacefully without checking his food for poison. The constant travel required for your profession eliminates opportunities to accumulate material possessions or establish any economic stability. You own only what you can carry, which means sacrificing comfort, security, and basic necessities for mobility. Your entire worldly wealth fits in a single pack that must remain light enough for rapid movement during emergency escapes. Equipment costs consume most of your meager earnings. Quality weapons require expensive materials and expert craftsmanship, then need constant maintenance and eventual replacement. Poisons cost more than their weight in silver, particularly exotic compounds that work reliably without betraying their presence through taste or odor. Specialized clothing, tools, and supplies drain your resources while providing minimal profit margins on completed contracts. Here's a particularly cruel irony. Assassins often couldn't afford the same quality gear used by the guards protecting their targets. You attack well-equipped professional soldiers while carrying inferior weapons and wearing cheaper armor because your poverty prevents accessing better equipment. This economic disadvantage directly increases mission failure rates, which further reduces your already pathetic income potential. The need for maintaining cover identities multiplies your expenses beyond sustainable levels. Each false persona requires appropriate clothing, documentation, and props to maintain credibility under scrutiny. A merchant identity needs sample goods and commercial knowledge. A pilgrim cover requires religious artifacts and appropriate destinations. These identity investments consume resources without generating returns, creating negative cash flow that worsens over time. Medical expenses represent another devastating financial burden that legitimate tradesmen rarely face. Your training injuries require ongoing treatment, mission wounds need professional healing, and the constant stress of your profession causes health problems that demand expensive remedies. Medieval medical care cost substantial sums even for simple treatments, while complex procedures for combat injuries could bankrupt patients who survived them. Historians still argue whether some elite assassins earned significant wealth from high-profile contracts, or if all practitioners remained economically marginalized regardless of their success rates. Evidence suggests that even the most skilled professionals lived modestly, possibly because assassination organizations claimed large percentages of contract fees as overhead expenses. The poverty creates cascading problems that compound your professional difficulties. Malnutrition reduces your physical capabilities and mental acuity when peak performance determines survival. Cheap lodging in dangerous areas increases your exposure to additional threats. Inferior equipment fails at critical moments, turning manageable situations into life-threatening disasters. You can't save money for emergencies, retirement, or career changes because immediate survival needs consume every available resource. This financial desperation forces you to accept increasingly dangerous contracts with worse terms, creating a downward spiral that typically ends in death rather than career advancement or economic improvement. The social stigma associated with your profession eliminates access to legitimate credit, banking services, or business partnerships that might improve your economic situation. Merchants won't extend credit to someone whose identity remains questionable and whose survival prospects appear minimal. This financial isolation forces you to operate exclusively in cash economies that offer no protection against theft or fraud. Perhaps most frustratingly, you watch your targets living in luxury that your actions help preserve, while your own poverty becomes more desperate with each successful mission. The nobles and merchants who hire your services enjoy wealth, comfort, and security that remain forever beyond your reach, despite your extraordinary skills and constant sacrifices on their behalf. Medieval hygiene standards were already appalling by modern measures, but life as an assassin introduces you to entirely new categories of filth and disease that make ordinary peasant squalor seem luxurious by comparison. Your profession demands living in conditions that actively promote infection, illness, and early death through means that have nothing to do with enemy weapons. The constant travel inherent in assassination work prevents establishing basic sanitary routines that even poor people maintained in their permanent homes. You sleep in different locations nightly, often in hiding places that haven't been cleaned in decades. Abandoned cellars crawling with vermin, forgotten caves filled with bat droppings, or derelict buildings where previous occupants left behind biological hazards that foster disease. Water for washing becomes a precious resource that you can't waste on hygiene when survival might depend on having enough to drink during extended pursuits or sieges. You learn to prioritize hydration over cleanliness, accepting body odor, accumulated grime, and skin infections as inevitable consequences of staying alive. But this calculated neglect of personal hygiene creates its own dangers through reduced immune function and increased susceptibility to disease. Your clothing becomes a mobile ecosystem of parasites, bacteria, and fungi that multiply in the warm, moist environment created by constant physical exertion and inadequate washing opportunities. Medieval assassins typically owned only single sets of garments due to weight restrictions, meaning the same clothes remained unwashed for months, while accumulating layers of sweat, blood, dirt, and worse substances encountered during missions. The disguises required for infiltrating target locations often demand adopting the hygiene standards of whatever social class you're impersonating. Pretending to be a beggar means deliberately cultivating authentic filth that includes genuine skin diseases, infected wounds, and parasite infestations that persist long after the mission ends. these theatrical infections become real health problems that compound over multiple assignments. Combat injuries in medieval times carried enormous infection risks, even with proper medical care. But assassins rarely access qualified physicians who might ask inconvenient questions about suspicious wound patterns. You learn crude field medicine techniques for treating stab wounds, broken bones, and poison exposure. But these self-administered treatments often cause additional complications that prove worse than the original injuries. Here's something particularly nasty that most people don't consider. Medieval poisons weren't precision instruments. They were crude compounds that often sickened the user through skin contact, inhalation, or accidental ingestion during preparation and application. Repeated exposure to these toxic substances causes cumulative organ damage that manifests as chronic illness, shortened lifespan, and agonizing death, even if you avoid violent endings. The stress of constant mortal danger suppresses immune function in ways that medieval practitioners couldn't understand, but definitely experienced. You become susceptible to diseases that healthy people resist easily, and minor infections that should heal quickly become serious medical emergencies. This compromised immunity makes every illness potentially fatal when you can't access proper treatment or rest. Medieval records from monastery infirmaries occasionally mention treating individuals with wound patterns consistent with professional violence, along with advanced stages of diseases associated with poor living conditions and chronic stress. These accounts suggest that even successful assassins suffered from multiple simultaneous health problems that would disable normal people completely. Dental health becomes particularly horrific when your diet consists of whatever food sources remain available during extended missions. You eat spoiled provisions, drink contaminated water, and consume emergency rations that lack essential nutrients needed for maintaining teeth and gums. Severe dental problems create chronic pain, reduce eating ability, and provide infection pathways that spread throughout your body. Sleep deprivation and constant stress accelerate aging processes that medieval people couldn't explain, but clearly observed. Contemporary accounts describe professional killers appearing decades older than their actual ages, with gray hair, deeply lined faces, and the physical frailty typically associated with much older individuals. This premature aging reflected the accumulated damage from lifestyle factors that modern medicine recognizes as extremely hazardous. Historians still argue whether medieval assassins had access to any form of organized medical care, or if practitioners relied entirely on folk remedies and self-treatment for health problems. Some evidence suggests that assassin organizations maintained crude infirmaries, but these facilities likely provided minimal care compared to monastery hospitals or court physicians available to legitimate patients. The psychological stress of your profession manifests in physical symptoms that medieval medicine couldn't effectively treat: chronic headaches, digestive problems, muscle tension, and skin conditions that worsened under pressure. These stress-related illnesses compounded the direct health effects of poor hygiene, creating cascading medical problems that shortened career spans and reduced mission effectiveness. Perhaps most ironically, maintaining the peak physical condition required for assassin work becomes increasingly impossible as accumulated health problems undermine your body's basic functions. You need superior strength, speed, and endurance to survive professional challenges. But your lifestyle systematically destroys the physiological foundations that such performance demands. The complete absence of genuine human connection represents perhaps the cruelest aspect of assassin life, transforming you into a living ghost who moves through society without ever truly participating in it. You watch normal people sharing meals, celebrating festivals, and forming lasting bonds, while knowing that such experiences remain forever beyond your reach. Every interaction becomes a performance designed to extract information, maintain cover identities, or advance mission objectives. You learn to simulate friendship, romance, and familial affection without ever experiencing these emotions genuinely. This constant emotional dishonesty creates a psychological split between your performed persona and your authentic self that widens over time until you're not sure which version represents reality anymore. The training that created you specifically eliminated capacity for normal attachment because emotional bonds represent tactical vulnerabilities that enemies can exploit. You are conditioned to view love as weakness, friendship as dangerous distraction, and family loyalty as obstacle to mission completion. But this conditioning doesn't eliminate human need for connection. It simply ensures that such needs can never be satisfied. Romantic relationships become impossible when intimacy requires trust that could prove fatal if misplaced. You can't share your real profession, past experiences, or future plans with potential partners because such honesty would endanger both of you. Instead, you maintain elaborate deceptions that prevent genuine emotional connection while creating additional stress through constant fear of discovery. Medieval society revolved around community celebrations, religious observances, and seasonal festivals that provided social cohesion and individual identity within larger groups. You observe these gatherings from shadows, understanding that participation would compromise your operational security, while recognizing everything you've sacrificed for your profession. The joy, belonging, and shared meaning that sustain normal people remain permanently inaccessible to you. The absence of family connections proves particularly devastating because medieval culture organized itself around kinship networks that provided economic support, social standing, and personal identity. You have no lineage to honor, no descendants to continue your legacy, and no relatives who remember your childhood before the transformation into something else entirely. Your existence carries no meaning beyond the missions that define your temporary value to distant employers. Here's something especially cruel about assassin psychology. You develop profound knowledge of human nature through studying targets and manipulating others. But this understanding only emphasizes your own isolation. You recognize authentic emotion in others while being incapable of experiencing it yourself, creating a form of emotional voyeurism that intensifies your sense of separation from normal humanity. Professional relationships with other assassins remain superficial and competitive because cooperation creates mutual vulnerabilities, while shared knowledge increases everyone's risk of exposure. You might work alongside colleagues occasionally, but friendship requires trust that could prove fatal if they receive contracts targeting you. These interactions emphasize your isolation rather than relieving it. The constant travel required for missions prevents establishing roots in any community, even superficially. You can't develop relationships with neighbors, regular merchants, or local craftsmen because extended presence in single locations increases recognition risks. This perpetual transience eliminates the gradual relationship building that creates social support networks for normal people. Medieval records suggest that some assassins attempted to maintain connections with their original families or childhood communities, but these efforts typically ended in tragedy when their profession brought danger to innocent relatives. The guilt from causing harm to loved ones through your mere existence compounds the isolation by making solitude seem like moral necessity rather than professional requirement. Historians still argue whether medieval assassins ever successfully retired to normal lives, or if the psychological conditioning made such transitions impossible. Evidence suggests that practitioners who attempted to leave their profession often struggled with severe depression, anxiety, and inability to form healthy relationships even after abandoning their lethal careers. The loneliness becomes self-perpetuating because years of isolation erode your ability to recognize or respond appropriately to genuine offers of friendship or affection. Normal social cues become foreign concepts that you analyze as potential threats rather than opportunities for human connection. This defensive interpretation of others' behavior ensures continued isolation even when genuine relationship opportunities arise. Religious faith, which provided comfort and community for most medieval people, becomes complicated when your profession involves regularly violating fundamental moral commandments. You can't confess your sins without risking exposure, can't participate honestly in religious observances, and can't find spiritual guidance from clergy who would be horrified by your actual activities. Perhaps most tragically, the isolation intensifies as you age because physical decline reduces your professional value while increasing your need for human support and care. Normal people rely on family members, friends, or community networks during their final years, but assassins face death as alone as they lived, with no one to mourn their passing or remember their existence. Every assignment you receive seems designed by someone who fundamentally misunderstands how reality works, featuring targets so well protected and situations so impossible that success requires either supernatural intervention or suicidal luck. Your employers consistently underestimate the difficulties involved in eliminating high-value individuals, while overestimating your abilities to overcome impossible obstacles. Medieval nobles didn't survive to positions of power by being careless with their personal security. Your typical target travels with professional bodyguards, sleeps in fortified locations, and maintains schedules so unpredictable that surveillance becomes nearly impossible. These aren't naive victims wandering alone through dark alleys. They're paranoid, experienced leaders who assume someone wants them dead because someone usually does. The intelligence provided for your missions invariably proves incomplete, outdated, or completely fictional. You're told the target maintains specific routines that changed months ago, lives in locations they abandoned last season, or trusts advisors who actually plot against them. This misinformation doesn't result from incompetence. It reflects the reality that accurate intelligence about well-protected individuals remains extremely difficult to obtain and verify. Infiltrating target locations requires skills that no amount of training can reliably provide. Medieval castles, fortified manors, and protected compounds were specifically designed to prevent unauthorized entry by people exactly like you. Multiple layers of guards, restricted access points, and architectural features that channel intruders into killing zones make penetration attempts extraordinarily dangerous, even when you possess detailed plans. Here's something particularly frustrating about medieval assassination contracts. Your employers expect you to eliminate targets without creating evidence that points back to them. But they also demand methods that clearly indicate professional involvement rather than accidents or random violence. This contradictory requirement forces you to demonstrate skill while maintaining plausible deniability, creating technical challenges that often prove impossible to resolve satisfactorily. The timing constraints imposed by clients reflect complete ignorance of operational realities. You're expected to eliminate targets during specific events, before certain dates, or after particular circumstances develop requirements that ignore the months of preparation needed for complex infiltration operations. These artificial deadlines force rushed planning that increases failure rates and reduces survival chances. Combat situations rarely resemble training scenarios because real environments contain variables that can't be anticipated or controlled. Your perfect technique for disabling guards assumes they'll be alone, alert, and positioned predictably. But actual guards travel in groups, maintain varying alertness levels, and respond unpredictably to threats. These deviations from training parameters often prove fatal during mission execution. Medieval weaponry and equipment limitations create additional complications that modern depictions consistently ignore. Your concealed blade might be detected by routine searches. Your poison could be neutralized by antidotes that targets routinely consume. Or your escape route might be blocked by construction, weather, or military activity that renders careful plans completely useless. The political situations surrounding your targets constantly evolve in ways that affect mission parameters without providing updated intelligence to reflect changed circumstances. The ally who was supposed to provide access might have switched sides. The distraction event you're counting on could be canceled, or the target's security arrangements might be completely revised between mission planning and execution phases. Historians still argue whether medieval assassinations succeeded as frequently as some sources suggest, or if successful eliminations were so unusual that they received disproportionate documentation while failures went unrecorded. The survival of detailed accounts describing successful missions might reflect their rarity rather than their frequency. Your escape plans depend on factors beyond your control: weather conditions, guard schedules, political situations, and transportation availability that can change without warning. Even perfectly executed eliminations become failures if you can't withdraw safely afterward, and withdrawal requires favorable circumstances that rarely align with mission timing requirements. The physical demands of infiltration operations exceed human capabilities more often than not. You're expected to climb vertical walls without equipment, remain motionless for hours in uncomfortable positions, or move silently through environments where noise seems inevitable. These expectations reflect fundamental misunderstanding of human limitations by employers who have never attempted such feats themselves. Perhaps most impossibly, your missions often require eliminating multiple targets simultaneously or in rapid succession, despite the reality that successful assassination attempts typically demand weeks of preparation focused on single individuals. The logistics of coordinating multiple eliminations while maintaining operational security become exponentially more complex with each additional target, creating failure cascades where single mistakes doom entire operations. The consequences of mission failure extend far beyond professional disappointment, because unsuccessful assassination attempts typically result in massive security responses that make future operations infinitely more difficult, while painting enormous targets on your back for elimination by the target's own operatives. Your weapons represent the pinnacle of medieval engineering applied to ending human life, which unfortunately means they're crude, unreliable instruments that fail at critical moments and require constant maintenance you can rarely provide. Every tool in your arsenal carries inherent limitations that compromise mission effectiveness while increasing personal danger through mechanical failures. Medieval metallurgy couldn't produce steel consistent enough for reliable blade performance, meaning your carefully crafted stiletto might shatter on impact with bone, bend under stress, or lose its edge after minimal use. The same weapon that performed flawlessly during training might catastrophically fail during your first real assignment, leaving you facing armed opponents with broken equipment and no backup options. Poison preparation required extensive knowledge of chemistry that medieval practitioners acquired through dangerous trial-and-error experimentation. Your toxic compounds might lose potency over time, react unpredictably with different foods or drinks, or prove insufficient for targets who have built tolerance through regular exposure to mild doses. The margin between effective and ineffective dosages remained unknown until testing on actual victims. Concealed weapons designed for infiltration missions prioritized hiding capability over combat effectiveness, creating tools that worked adequately when used perfectly, but failed disastrously under stress. Your disguised blade might be too short for reliable kills, too fragile for repeated use, or positioned awkwardly for quick deployment when situations demanded immediate response. Here's something particularly maddening about medieval assassin equipment. Everything required manual crafting by specialized artisans who asked inconvenient questions about intended uses. You couldn't simply purchase assassination tools from regular merchants, which meant either revealing your profession to weaponsmiths or accepting inferior gear that looked appropriate but performed inadequately when lives depended on reliability. The maintenance requirements for specialized equipment exceeded what traveling assassins could reasonably provide. Your weapons needed regular sharpening with specific stones. Your poisons required proper storage conditions that prevented degradation, and your disguise materials demanded careful preservation that became impossible during extended missions in harsh environments. Improvised weapons, while theoretically available everywhere, required extensive practice with specific items to achieve reliable lethality. The eating knife you grabbed during an emergency might be balanced incorrectly for throwing, made from metal too soft for effective stabbing, or shaped in ways that prevented proper grip during actual combat situations. Medieval armor worn by your targets continuously improved throughout the period, making weapons that worked against earlier protection completely ineffective against newer defensive technologies. Your techniques for defeating chainmail became useless against plate armor, while methods developed for penetrating leather proved inadequate against reinforced clothing that wealthy targets increasingly adopted. The crossbows and other ranged weapons available to medieval assassins suffered from fundamental design limitations that made accurate shooting extremely difficult under field conditions. These weapons required extensive preparation time for loading, couldn't be reloaded quickly during combat, and produced distinctive sounds that alerted everyone within considerable distances to your location. Historians still argue whether medieval assassins had access to exotic weapons imported from distant regions, or if practitioners relied primarily on locally available tools that offered no significant advantages over equipment used by conventional soldiers. The legendary poisoned needles and specialized blades described in some accounts might represent fictional embellishments rather than historical reality. Your climbing equipment consisted of crude ropes, grappling hooks, and improvised anchors that regularly failed under stress, often at heights where falls meant certain death. Medieval rope manufacturing produced inconsistent results where some sections might support considerable weight, while adjacent areas possessed fatal weak points that couldn't be detected before catastrophic failure occurred. Lock-picking tools remained primitive instruments that worked only against simple mechanisms, while most valuable targets protected themselves with complex mechanical locks that resisted all but the most sophisticated manipulation techniques. The time required for bypassing security devices often exceeded the available window for mission completion, forcing you to resort to more violent entry methods that compromised stealth objectives. Fire-based weapons like Greek fire or incendiary compounds proved notoriously unstable during transport and storage, frequently igniting spontaneously and burning their users rather than intended targets. These substances required careful handling that became impossible during rapid movement or stressful situations, making them more dangerous to assassins than their victims. The disguise materials available during medieval times consisted of crude cosmetics, simple clothing alterations, and basic prosthetics that fooled casual observation, but failed under scrutiny from suspicious guards or observant targets. Your false beard might fall off at critical moments, your skin dye could run in rain, or your padding might shift visibly during physical activity. Perhaps most frustratingly, the tools that worked best for assassination, heavy weapons, reliable armor, and effective ranged equipment, were precisely the items you couldn't carry while maintaining necessary stealth and mobility. This forced constant compromise between capability and concealment that usually resulted in being under-equipped for whatever situations actually developed during missions. The mental toll of repeatedly ending human lives destroys your psychological foundation in ways that medieval practitioners couldn't articulate, but definitely experienced through nightmares, paranoid episodes, and gradual disconnection from reality itself. Each successful elimination adds another layer of psychological damage that accumulates over time until your mind begins fragmenting under pressures that no human psyche can indefinitely withstand. Your first kill remains permanently etched in memory with devastating clarity that includes every sensory detail, the target's final expression, the specific sound they made while dying, the way their body felt during the moments when life departed. This vivid recollection doesn't fade over time. Instead, it becomes a baseline trauma that colors every subsequent killing with additional layers of horror and guilt. The dehumanization training that made you capable of murder creates cognitive dissonance when you observe your victims as complete human beings with families, dreams, and complex inner lives that mirror your own suppressed humanity. You're simultaneously required to view targets as obstacles to be eliminated and to understand them thoroughly enough to predict their behavior and exploit their vulnerabilities. Sleep becomes increasingly elusive as your subconscious mind processes accumulated trauma through recurring nightmares that replay past killings with disturbing variations. You experience dreams where victims survive and seek revenge, where their families discover your identity and pursue justice, or where you become the target of other assassins using your own methods against you. Medieval understanding of mental illness provided no framework for recognizing or treating what modern psychology identifies as severe post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, and anxiety disorders that inevitably develop from repeated exposure to extreme violence you're expected to function normally despite carrying psychological burdens that would hospitalize contemporary patients receiving professional treatment. The isolation required for operational security prevents seeking emotional support or sharing traumatic experiences with others who might provide comfort or understanding. You process each killing entirely alone, without counseling, religious guidance, or human connection that could help maintain psychological stability under such extreme circumstances. Here's something particularly twisted about assassin psychology. You develop professional pride in elimination techniques while simultaneously experiencing moral revulsion at your actions, creating internal conflicts that intensify with each successful mission. Your expertise grows alongside your self-hatred, making you increasingly effective at activities that destroy your mental health. The constant hypervigilance required for survival creates chronic stress responses that manifest as physical symptoms: muscle tension, digestive problems, cardiovascular issues, and immune system suppression that compound the psychological damage with deteriorating physical health. Your body literally breaks down under mental pressures that exceed human design tolerances. Dissociation becomes a survival mechanism where you mentally separate during killings, observing your actions as if watching someone else perform the violence. This psychological defense initially provides protection from immediate trauma, but eventually creates identity fragmentation where you're never entirely present or authentic in any situation. The moral framework that governs normal human behavior becomes completely disrupted when your survival depends on violating fundamental ethical principles. You can't maintain consistent moral standards while regularly committing acts that all religious and secular authorities condemn as ultimate evil, creating ethical confusion that undermines decision-making abilities. Historians still argue whether medieval assassins experienced psychological breakdown rates similar to modern combat veterans, or if cultural factors provided better coping mechanisms for extreme violence. Some evidence suggests that religious justifications and social acceptance of violence reduced psychological trauma, while other sources describe practitioners exhibiting clear symptoms of severe mental illness. The gradual erosion of empathy that enables continued killing also eliminates your capacity for normal human relationships, spiritual fulfillment, and personal growth that provide meaning and satisfaction for others. You become increasingly hollow as psychological defenses against trauma simultaneously protect and isolate you from positive human experiences. Substance abuse often develops as self-medication for psychological pain that can't be addressed through legitimate means. Medieval practitioners turned to alcohol, opium, or other available intoxicants to numb emotional suffering. But these substances created additional problems, including addiction, impaired judgment, and increased mission failure rates. The knowledge that your actions cause immeasurable suffering to victims' families, friends, and communities creates guilt that compounds over time regardless of whether targets deserved elimination. You carry responsibility not just for deaths themselves, but for all the grief, economic hardship, and social disruption that follows from removing individuals from their communities. Perhaps most devastatingly, the psychological damage proves largely irreversible even if you somehow escape the profession alive. The conditioning that enabled killing can't be undone. The traumatic memories remain vivid throughout life, and the altered brain chemistry that developed through repeated violence exposure persists indefinitely, ensuring that you'll never recover the mental health that was sacrificed for temporary tactical advantage. Your employers view you as a useful tool rather than a valued professional, which means they'll discard, manipulate, or eliminate you without hesitation, whenever doing so serves their interests. The same people who hire your services also consider you their greatest security risk, creating inherent conflicts of interest that guarantee eventual betrayal regardless of your loyalty or service quality. The organizational structure of medieval assassination networks actively encouraged internal betrayal through competitive hierarchies, where advancement required eliminating rivals rather than demonstrating superior performance. Your fellow assassins represent threats to your position, potential competitors for lucrative contracts, and sources of dangerous information that enemies might extract through torture or bribery. Contract terms invariably contain hidden clauses or unstated expectations that provide employers with justifications for refusing payment, altering mission parameters, or claiming breach of agreement when convenient. You discover these trap provisions only after completing dangerous assignments, when you're already committed and vulnerable to retaliation if you object to changed conditions. The political situations that generate assassination contracts remain fluid throughout mission durations, meaning your target might become your employer's ally before you complete elimination orders. These shifted allegiances transform successful missions into diplomatic embarrassments that require covering up through eliminating the assassin who carried out now inconvenient orders. Here's something particularly vicious about medieval political intrigue. The same noble who hires you to eliminate rival courtiers might simultaneously hire other assassins to eliminate you, creating multiple revenue streams while ensuring that no surviving witnesses can connect them to any specific murders. Your success makes you more valuable dead than alive to clients who benefit from your skills but fear your knowledge. Information warfare among competing factions often involves feeding false intelligence to assassin networks, knowing that practitioners will act on received data regardless of accuracy. You might spend weeks preparing to eliminate someone who's already dead, while the real target uses your misdirection as opportunity to identify and eliminate their enemy's operational assets. The training organizations that created you maintain financial interests in practitioner turnover because dead assassins can't reveal training methods, organizational structures, or client identities to enemies. Your graduation represents not just professional qualification, but also the beginning of planned obsolescence, where your creators actively work toward your elimination. Once you've completed sufficient missions to justify training investments. Medieval record-keeping practices provided employers with plausible deniability for any assassination contracts by maintaining deliberately incomplete documentation that couldn't prove specific agreements or payment arrangements. Your word against theirs meant nothing in legal systems where your testimony carried no weight due to criminal profession and social status. The compartmentalized communication systems used by assassination networks created opportunities for manipulation where different operatives received conflicting information about the same missions. You might discover that other assassins received contracts targeting you while you were eliminating their assigned victims, creating mutual destruction cycles that eliminated multiple practitioners while protecting organizational leadership. Double agents working within assassin networks provided intelligence to multiple competing factions while advancing their own agendas through strategic betrayals that sacrificed expendable operatives. These embedded traitors often held leadership positions that allowed them to manipulate mission assignments, compromise operational security, and eliminate rivals while maintaining cover identities. Historians still argue whether medieval assassination organizations developed countermeasures against internal betrayal, or if treachery remained so endemic that these groups regularly self-destructed through accumulated mistrust and double crosses. Evidence suggests that successful networks required constant purges to remove suspected traitors, creating climates of fear that reduced operational effectiveness. The economic incentives surrounding assassination contracts encouraged betrayal because eliminating the hired killer provided employers with perfect cost savings while removing potential witnesses to criminal activity. The final payment installment that you never lived to collect represented pure profit for clients who benefited from your work without honoring agreed compensation. Religious and moral justifications used to recruit assassins often proved fabricated excuses designed to motivate practitioners toward missions that served purely secular political objectives. You might discover that the holy war you thought you were fighting actually advanced the commercial interests of merchants who viewed religious conflict as profitable business opportunity rather than spiritual necessity. Your handlers maintained detailed knowledge about your capabilities, weaknesses, and psychological vulnerabilities that could be exploited for manipulation or elimination whenever convenient. The same people who claimed to support your missions also compiled intelligence that enemies could use against you, essentially creating your own operational profile for future targeting. Perhaps most cruelly, the loyalty and dedication that made you effective as an assassin also made you vulnerable to exploitation by employers who recognized these qualities as manipulable weaknesses rather than professional strengths. Your commitment to completing assignments, regardless of personal cost, provided perfect justification for assigning increasingly dangerous missions, until inevitable failure eliminated a useful but ultimately disposable asset. Medieval assassins didn't fade gracefully into peaceful anonymity. They died violently, usually sooner rather than later, because the profession offered no legitimate exit strategies that didn't involve either betrayal by former colleagues or elimination by past enemies seeking revenge. Your career trajectory points inevitably toward a grave rather than retirement, with each successful mission bringing you closer to final failure. The skills that made you valuable as a practitioner also made you dangerous as a retiree, because your knowledge of techniques, targets, and organizational secrets represented ongoing security risks that former employers couldn't tolerate. Retired assassins knew too much about too many powerful people, creating situations where permanent silence became the only acceptable solution for protecting institutional interests. Physical decline hits assassin practitioners harder than normal aging affects other professionals, because your livelihood depends entirely on maintaining peak capabilities that naturally diminish over time. Your reflexes slow, your strength decreases, your endurance reduces, and your sensory acuity degrades at rates that make continued effectiveness impossible, while eliminating opportunities for career transitions. The paranoia and mistrust that enabled survival during active service also prevented building relationships or acquiring legitimate skills that might support civilian life after leaving the profession. You developed no marketable abilities beyond killing, formed no social connections that could provide support, and established no economic foundation that could sustain retirement from dangerous work. Medieval society provided no social safety net for aging criminals who could no longer practice their illegal trades, particularly when those trades involved activities that horrified normal citizens. Former assassins couldn't seek assistance from religious organizations, guild systems, or community support networks that might help other workers transition into different occupations or retire from active labor. Here's something especially grim about assassin career trajectories. The window between peak effectiveness and complete incapacity remained extremely narrow, typically lasting only a few years, during which practitioners needed to somehow accumulate enough resources for permanent retirement, while simultaneously maintaining the paranoid lifestyle that prevented saving money or planning for the future. The accumulated injuries from years of violent work created chronic pain, reduced mobility, and ongoing medical expenses that consumed whatever meager savings older practitioners managed to accumulate. Former assassins suffered from arthritis, untreated fractures, nerve damage, and organ problems that required expensive treatment, while preventing them from earning income through less demanding work. Your extensive roster of enemies didn't forget past grievances just because you stopped accepting new contracts. Relatives of former targets, rival assassins, betrayed employers, and law enforcement officials maintained active interest in settling scores regardless of your current activity level or retirement status. These accumulated grudges ensured continued danger long after you ceased being an active threat. The psychological damage from years of killing and isolation made normal social integration impossible, even if physical safety could somehow be guaranteed. Former assassins couldn't form healthy relationships, find meaningful work, or discover purpose beyond violence because their conditioning eliminated the mental flexibility needed for successful life transitions. Substance abuse problems that developed during active careers typically worsened during attempted retirement periods because practitioners lost the adrenaline highs and sense of purpose that made their lives bearable despite constant danger. Former assassins often drank themselves to death or overdosed on available drugs rather than facing the emptiness of civilian existence. Historians still argue whether any medieval assassins successfully transitioned to peaceful lives, or if documented cases of career changes represent fictional accounts rather than historical realities. The absence of reliable evidence for successful retirement might reflect either the rarity of such outcomes or the secrecy required for protecting former practitioners from ongoing threats. The organizations that trained and employed assassins had strong incentives to eliminate retiring practitioners rather than risk exposure through captured or interrogated former operatives. Your graduation from active service often triggered elimination orders designed to protect organizational security by removing potential sources of compromising information about methods, personnel, and past operations. Financial planning for retirement became impossible when your profession demanded maintaining liquid resources for immediate survival needs rather than long-term investment strategies. You couldn't accumulate property, establish business interests, or build economic foundations that might support later years, because doing so created vulnerabilities that enemies could exploit for tracking or manipulation purposes. The constant stress of assassin work created health problems that dramatically shortened life expectancy, even for practitioners who avoided violent deaths during active careers. Heart disease, stroke, immune system collapse, and stress-related organ failure typically claimed former assassins within years of attempting retirement, making long-term planning largely irrelevant to career outcomes. Perhaps most tragically, the few assassins who survived long enough to consider retirement often discovered that their accumulated psychological damage made peaceful existence more unbearable than continued violence, leading them to accept increasingly suicidal missions rather than face the prospect of living with memories they couldn't escape and guilt they couldn't resolve. Your end comes not with dramatic sword fights or spectacular chases, but through quiet mistakes that accumulate until one final miscalculation transforms routine missions into death sentences. Perhaps your reflexes slow just enough for a target's guard to land a fatal blow, or maybe years of accumulated enemies finally coordinate their revenge efforts successfully. The specifics matter less than the inevitability. Every assassin's story concludes the same way. The moments before death bring unwelcome clarity about the choices that led to this inevitable conclusion. You recognize that every path you took narrowed future options until only violent endings remained possible. The childhood dreams destroyed by training, the relationships sacrificed for operational security, the moral compromises that seemed necessary at the time, all crystallize into final understanding of what was lost and what was never truly gained. Your thoughts turn to targets whose names you remember despite trying to forget them, wondering if their families still grieve, whether their children grew up safely, and how many lives were damaged by your professional activities. The dehumanization training that made killing possible begins breaking down as death approaches, restoring empathy at precisely the moment when such understanding becomes most painful. The wealth you never accumulated, the peace you never experienced, and the love you never allowed yourself to feel represent missed opportunities that seem infinitely precious now that they're permanently beyond reach. You realize that even successful completion of every mission ultimately meant nothing, because the profession itself was designed to consume practitioners rather than reward them. Medieval death rarely comes quickly or painlessly, particularly for people whose enemies have strong motivations for ensuring prolonged suffering. Your final hours might involve torture designed to extract information about past operations, organizational structures, or hidden resources that could benefit your captors. The same pain tolerance that served you during training becomes curse rather than blessing when applied by skilled interrogators. Here's something particularly cruel about assassin death. Your extensive knowledge of human anatomy and efficient killing methods makes you acutely aware of exactly how your own death is progressing, what damage is being inflicted, and approximately how much time remains before consciousness ends. This technical understanding transforms dying into detailed medical observation of your own destruction. The isolation that defined your entire career continues during final moments, because no friends, family members, or colleagues will mourn your passing or remember your existence with affection. You die as you lived, alone, unknown, and ultimately irrelevant to anyone except briefly to those who benefit from your elimination. Your body will likely disappear without proper burial, thrown into unmarked graves, fed to animals, or simply left to rot in whatever location proved convenient for your killers. The religious rites that provided comfort to medieval people during death remain unavailable because clergy wouldn't knowingly administer last sacraments to professional murderers, even if time and circumstances permitted such spiritual care. The organizational legacy you helped build through years of dedicated service will continue operating without missing your contributions, training new practitioners to fill your role while learning from whatever mistakes led to your capture or elimination. Your death becomes case study material for improving future operational security, rather than loss worthy of genuine grief or remembrance. Historians still argue whether medieval assassins experienced deathbed repentance or maintained professional pride during final moments. But contemporary accounts suggest that most practitioners died with regret rather than satisfaction about their life choices. the psychological conditioning that enabled their careers apparently broke down when confronted with mortality's ultimate reality. Perhaps most ironically, your death might provide the first genuine peace you've experienced since childhood, ending the constant hypervigilance, chronic pain, and accumulated guilt that made life increasingly unbearable over time. The cessation of consciousness represents liberation from psychological burdens that had become heavier than the prospect of non-existence. As darkness closes in, you find yourself thinking not about professional accomplishments or successful missions, but about the person you might have become if different choices had been available. The child who loved simple pleasures, trusted other people, and dreamed innocent dreams seems like someone you once knew rather than who you actually were before the transformation began. Your final breath escapes with barely a whisper, carrying away the last remnant of someone whose potential was sacrificed for purposes that ultimately served others' interests rather than your own. The world continues without pause or recognition that another human story has concluded, leaving behind only the fading warmth of flesh that will soon return to dust, forgotten and unmourned. The candle flame flickers lower now, shadows dancing one final time across stone walls that have witnessed countless similar endings. Your eyes grow heavy as the weight of this tale settles around you like a familiar blanket, reminding you of how precious it is to live openly, love freely, and sleep peacefully in beds where no enemies wait in darkness. The medieval world fades back into history where it belongs, leaving you safely in your own time, surrounded by the gentle sounds of modern life that those long-dead assassins could never enjoy. Rest now, knowing that your dreams tonight will be your own, untroubled by the ghosts of choices you'll never need to make. The story ends here, but your story, the real one, the one filled with possibility and hope, continues tomorrow when you wake to sunlight streaming through windows, carrying with it all the ordinary miracles that make peaceful existence extraordinary. Sleep well, dear listener, and remember that the greatest adventure is simply being alive in a world where such terrible fates remain safely confined to history's shadows.